Now with us is Behnam Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being with us. So this is turning into one of the key demands of the Iranians to remove the IRGC from that list of international terrorist organizations. Do you feel like the U.S. wants to comply with that?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, this is not a new story. Based on at least two sources in Persian, one, the former chief of staff of the former president, and two, the report of the foreign ministry to the parliament before the outgoing Rouhani administration, both of those sources last summer had confirmed that the Biden administration had already agreed to remove the FTO listing, the Foreign Terrorist Organization listing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from American sanctions lists. That is the claim that the Iranians have had, and it's actually recently come up again and again in 2022. I think it would be a gross mistake, a strategic mistake, a self-inflicted wound. The IRGC has American blood, allied blood on its hands. As you mentioned, it controls and co-opted a constellation of local militia groups and terrorist proxies throughout the region with which it fights U.S. partners and allies such as Israel. Giving into this non-nuclear demand in a deal that is supposed to be nuclear only, which we can get into if you wish, would be, again, the definition of a self-inflicted wound and an own goal, especially this late in the negotiations.
Right, and sort of what you make of the Israel Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister issuing this statement, talking about those proxies that the IRGC controls, Hezbollah, Houthis, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and maybe there are even other countries in the region who are affected by these proxies, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states with the Houthis, for example, who might also try to say something here. Is Israel alone in kind of trying to pressure the U.S.?
Well, regardless of who joins diplomatically the coalition, whether it's some of the GCC states you mentioned, whether it's Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, or even countries where the government is divided, a country like Iraq, for instance. Iran has used the IRGC to puncture that state, puncture that society, puncture that country's economy, social and religious institutions even, and to try to turn it on its head and subvert it. So there may be a lot of desire for America, for some of these regional states, not to end up giving not to end up permitting the U.S. or greenlighting the U.S. to give this relief, but ultimately they may not necessarily vocalize it. But all those countries that we mentioned, they have been the targets of IRGC and IRGC-backed aggression. So it would be not just a strategic setback for America, it would be a strategic setback for that constellation of partners that we talked about, the GCC states, as well as Iraq, let alone Israel. So while Israel diplomatically has taken the initiative to bring up this issue, even if the other states don't diplomatically, publicly bring it up, you can bet your bottom dollar that they have concerns about this.
Right, behind closed doors, potentially talking about that. I want to ask you about the major event that's taking place, of course, which is the Russian war in Ukraine. This is obviously having an impact on the negotiations. Do you feel like maybe the United States and others are underestimating the Iranian threat because of what's happening in Russia? They want to get their hands on the Iranian oil, of course, because Russia is being sanctioned, and just in general, this whole threat from Russia has kind of overshadowed the potential that maybe Iran could be something similar if they have nuclear weapons to back up their threats.
Partially. I think that one of the larger strategic orienting flaws of the Biden administration's approach is that it thinks he can segment out these theaters of competition, these theaters of conflict, and these bad actors, when in reality there is much more linkage, particularly much more linkage that meets the eye between Iran and Putin's Russia, for instance. It makes no sense to be giving Iran sanctions relief and then trying to be giving Putin a channel with which to bust some of the sanctions that he is facing now over Ukraine. And that's essentially was a key Russian demand. And it seems like the U.S., unfortunately, may have acceded to that demand. So I think that the larger issue for Washington is don't think that you need to rush back into a deal that was fatally flawed by 2015 standards just so you can cap one thread and pivot. Because the reality is there is no such thing as capping and pivoting. You have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. This is what is required of a superpower in the 21st century. And we have to call a spade and look at the linkages between Russia and Iran today, be able to call them out and combat them together.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. Thank you very much for helping us understand those issues.
Thank you.